Are she, her. I am the director of the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative. We are a network for cities and agencies across the San Diego region. We're also a research entity, so we see ourselves as a gap filler and try to create resources that really support our practitioners across our region. So I'm joined today by my colleague. I'll let Nichole introduce herself.
Can you all hear me without a microphone? Okay, I'm Nichole Wissman. I'm a professor of management at the University of San Diego. I work on an equity-first approach to climate adaptation at Darbi. And I'm also the co-director of the environmental. So we're excited to present our workshop today.
Yeah, awesome. So I'm really excited. So this is going to be a pretty interactive session towards the end of the training as well. So we're not going to talk for too long, but do just kind of want to give you an overview of what we were doing and what we've done in the San Diego region and how we're moving forward on that. But before we get started, I know a lot of folks have been probably in sessions all week. I know it's been a really enriching time, so super appreciate all of you sticking it out till Thursday and coming here in the morning to hang out with us. But so I passed out sticky notes. If you don't have one, maybe just raise your hand. We'll make sure you get one. But on your sticky note, if you could, I see one in the back corner, in one word, describe what climate equity means to you. I gave them to Langston. Yeah, Langston has them. He's our room support. Yeah, so if you're just coming in on your sticky note, if you could, in one word, describe what climate equity means to you. Is anyone done? Can I call on anyone to maybe share what they wrote? Anyone? Yeah, that's kind of the point. Yeah, it's really challenging. Langston? Listening. Yeah, awesome. Definitely a good word. Inclusion. Yeah. Anyone else? Love it. More than one word, but participation. See some other folks had that one too. Corrective. I really like that. Fairness. Awesome. So I really appreciate you all doing this. I also wanted to kind of acknowledge how challenging it is for us to work in an equity framework, but also distill our work into an equity framework. However, in a lot of our roles and a lot of the spaces that we work in, particularly in the San Diego region and in the adaptation space, we're working with a lot of practitioners who are challenged to try to distill equity to fit into different guidances, different guidelines, different grant programs to make it, work. And so often sometimes things get lost in translation. So, the more we can kind of think about how we're translating this and distilling it down is also going to help us communicate it. So you can either keep your sticky notes, or I would encourage you to maybe put them on to kind of wear them throughout the day so folks can see you in the rest of, when we get around in groups later, it might be helpful to have them. But so our project, I just wanted to give a little background of why we did this, we being the Climate Collaborative. And for folks who aren't familiar, the Climate Collaborative structure, we've been around, the San Diego Regional Climate Collaborative has been around for 12 years, but our collaborative structure is really focused on giving our cities and agencies a space to have conversations about the challenges of doing different elements of both climate action planning and climate adaptation planning, and also find spaces to elevate solutions. We're also kind of a responsive agency, so we really try to do research that our member agencies are asking us for. Often, a lot of times, it's hard for jurisdictions to work outside of their own specific jurisdiction. And so having some sort of agency to step in to see what's going on in the region, because we can all probably infer that climate impacts aren't going to stop where your jurisdictional boundary is going to stop. And so planning for them it's really important that you're working beyond that, but it's oftentimes hard for our cities to find funding to do vulnerability assessments of assets that are outside their, jurisdictional control. So back in 2018, SANDAG, which is our regional MPO in San Diego, was awarded funding to conduct an adaptation needs assessment. And so they hired us to work with them to prepare this needs assessment and kind of just get an understanding of where is the region on the front of adaptation and, why aren't we moving forward, or what are the needs for us to move to that next phase. So we completed that review in 2020. We interviewed over 70 practitioners, both from cities and agencies, as well as CBOs and nonprofit advocacy organizations who are kind of advancing policy and protocols in the region. Probably no surprise to anyone in this room, but the biggest things we found was a need for staffing capacity, a need for localized and regionalized technical assistance, so folks who are on the ground and understand the problems that are really happening in our region, and then full project lifecycle funding, so not just funding for the planning phase of the project, but then for the permitting, for engineer, design, implementation. The biggest thing that also came out of this, though, is that because folks hadn't really started moving forward on adaptation, at the time we published this, none of our cities in the region had an adaptation plan in place. That they really wanted to make sure that they understood how to do equity right. A lot of our climate action plans have been really good on the front of mitigation and greenhouse gases, but really lacking on the equity and diversity inclusion, actually impacting our vulnerable communities. So folks wanted to understand, how do we do this better? So as a result, we were awarded an additional round of funding to do just this and kind of look at a suite of impacts across equity and economic benefits as it relates to adaptation planning. And so Nichole and I worked together with a couple of other folks and experts in the region to produce this equity first guidance document. So the key takeaways from today that I hope we're going to get out of this is just the first kind of introductory space of this guidance document, defining climate equity and justice, defining and assessing the dimensions of justice. So we'll go through the framework that we've approached for this, identifying climate shocks and stressors within a relationship to vulnerable populations, and identifying opportunities and pathways to equitably address the dimensions of equity starting at phase 0, so ground liftoff. So just kind of want to ground us in some of these spaces, why this is so important. A lot of our assessments and vulnerability work that we do to date really focuses on the climate hazards themselves. And a lot of our work, particularly in the San Diego region, is very hazard focused. So we're either looking at coastal zone impacts, we're either looking at wildfire, and a lot of it is in response to a particular flooding event or wildfire hazard and disaster. But when we think about this from an equity lens, it's really important to kind of reframe that it's not just about the hazard and the buildings or the land, the power lines that are in the way, but how that actually relates to the historical and existing inequities in our spaces. So really trying to take this framework of not just talking about wildfire is, going to be rampant through this community, but the inequities after that disaster of who is able and accessible to the disaster response recovery aid, who is now being impacted by that air pollution, thinking of like our outdoor and essential workers. When we talk about extreme heat, we talk about from the equity perspective, it's not just that our, communities are hotter, but it's also in the San Diego region, no one has AC. So it's also just this, not just systemic, but extrapolating problem of the higher cost. Even if you do have AC, you probably can't afford to run it because the energy costs are going up at that time. Or people who rely on public transit, they're outdoors, they're in extreme spaces. A lot of our public transit covers don't have shade structures because we don't have snow or rain. So why spend the money on them in the first place, right? But there's these other health and underlying impacts. So kind of just wanted to ground us there. And I'm going to pass it to my colleague Nichole to take over.
Okay, great. So our main approach here is transformative adaptation. So what we did is we looked at academic literature to identify best practices and identify what went wrong, as academics were very good at identifying the problems that are happening with climate adaptation. But at the same time, we wanted to also look at what's happening on the ground. So we reviewed a lot of policy documents on what other cities and regions are doing to integrate equity and adaptation. So we came up with, and building from Linda Shee and Susan Moser's work on climate adaptation, we developed this, we extended the idea of transformative adaptation to a practice-based project. So that's how we built our framework here. So transformative adaptation means understanding that the inequities that exist in the first place, identifying those and understanding the root causes of what's happening. And at the same time, taking a socio-ecological or systems approach to this understanding that people are embedded in place and experience place differently. So adaptation, our built environment, and our institutions that are addressing adaptation really have to understand people in place, and that this is historically connected through things like redlining. And that transformative part is harnessing those resources that are coming down the pipeline for adaptation in order to change the system, right? So really embedding an equity-first approach in everything that we're doing, embedding adaptation, and helping planners understand to build their own capacity and also build community capacity for adaptation. So we build from the APG, Climate Adaptation Planning Guide in California, from the state of California. So they don't include a phase 0 here. So we thought this is where we need to start. We need to understand what the problems are and why they exist in the first place. So why there might be distrust with communities when our government agencies go in to begin the process of collaboration, and how you can overcome some of those and start integrating equity into all phases of the adaptation process. So we have a couple definitions of equity and climate justice here. So climate equity is addressing historical inequities suffered by historically marginalized groups, as well as folks who are have different health statuses, who particularly in the region of San Diego, immigration status can be a key issue, and allowing everyone to fairly share the same benefits and burdens from climate solutions and attain full and equal access to opportunities regardless of one's background and identity. And climate justice is the concept that no group of people should disproportionately bear the burden of climate impacts or the cost of mitigation and adaptation. At the same time, with climate justice, we also strongly recognize in this document that there's climate privilege, right? That some folks don't have to think about this, and particularly those with stable jobs that might work for government agencies. So it's really breaking down those ideas of, or those assumptions of what communities need and recognizing our own climate privilege in this process. We developed our equitable adaptation framework working from environmental and climate justice literature, urban studies, and organizational justice approaches. So first, I've been really talking about recognition and structural equity. Those are the things that we see, right? The inequities that exist, such as maybe unequal pay, uneven burden of pollution, those types of things, but also recognizing that there are historical roots from things like redlining, structural racism, and chronic stresses that communities experience on a regular basis. But those things also exist because inequities in procedure, interaction, and distribution. So procedural equity is perception of fairness, the procedures and decision-making processes, how communities are engaged in those processes, and thinking about those power dynamics within them. Interactional justice takes it down a level to thinking about those power dynamics one-on-one, right? When you're going into a group of people and you're interacting with them, how do they perceive those power dynamics? It's really that interpersonal interaction. Distributive equity, and we talk a lot about this when we talk about equity and climate change or climate adaptation. It's really thinking about who has access to resources, who is going to bear the burden of those climate impacts, and who's going to benefit from those climate impacts. So thinking about how our resources are distributed now and how it also ties to recognition and structural equity. So when we think about who's going to bear the burden of climate impacts, all of us are going to bear the burden of climate impacts in some way, but we have to think about how those shocks and stressors are going to impact historically marginalized and more vulnerable populations. So shocks are those external short-term deviations from long-term trends. These can be things like wildfires, individual weather events, blackouts that happen for a 24 to 48 hour period. And they can have substantial negative impacts on people's current state of well-being, level of assets, livelihood, safety, and their ability to withstand future shocks. And that idea is that if a family has to evacuate because of a wildfire, they may not be able to recover very quickly after that wildfire, or it can make them more vulnerable. And we particularly see that with access to disaster recovery aid. So Black and brown families tend to lose wealth after a disaster, where white households gain wealth after a disaster. And that's really embedded in our procedures and the way that we're handling climate impacts and these shocks. Stressors are those day-to-day things, and they're really important, particularly to the groups that we're talking about today. So that can be heat and energy usage. So during a heat wave where, in California, electricity is very, very expensive. So if you have to increase your cooling costs, you're bearing a significant burden. Or pollution, right? Pollution's another one. And just to read here, the definition is long-term pressures, so the degradation of natural resources, urbanization, political instability, or diminishing social capital that breaks up kind of community cohesion during stressors, undermine the stability of a system and increase the vulnerabilities within it. And a way to think about this is those starting point vulnerabilities. And starting point vulnerabilities are those deep roots and conditions that produce vulnerabilities in the first place. And these are embedded in unequal processes, institutions, and systems. So thinking about where people are starting from, and that there is structural and institutional reasons why those inequities exist. We tend to focus on endpoint vulnerabilities, and those are the most visible symptoms of past development patterns, societal relations, and human-environment interactions. Those are the things that we tend to focus on. So we hope with this document and the training today that we can dive a bit deeper past those endpoint vulnerabilities and think about ways that we can integrate equity and adaptation in the work that we do. And that work, in kind of a generic way, is either infrastructure or institution. Of course, there are other types of work here, but we'll talk about those two adaptation strategies. So infrastructure is that built environment, modifying or expanding infrastructure, maintenance, things like beach nourishment projects, and the costs and benefits of these strategies to communities, right? Who benefits from these strategies and who might have a burden, such as climate or green gentrification. And it's also institutional, right? Those responses that include strategies such as providing public awareness, coordination with community groups, long-term coordination and trust building with community groups, and building capacity of staff. So that's it for me. That was our method and approach and the deep kind of theoretical basis that informs this project. So I'll pass it back over to Darbi.
Yeah, so do want to get folks talking and moving here in a minute, but as Nichole mentioned, I think for us to kind of translate this to practitioners, it's really important to understand that the process of adaptation and planning for adaptation, that statement in itself is inherently a statement of privilege, right? To have the ability to have the foresight to see what is coming and be able to, retroactively prepare and make sure that we are, more resilient in the face of is inherently a concept of privilege. And so recognizing that these structural and different inequities that we have historically across our communities, in the U.S. and other places, but particularly here in our context is, a result of this. And because we have those, not all spaces have that inherent privilege to adapt. It's also a recognition that our communities who are most vulnerable are already facing climate impacts are already the experts in adaptation. And so a lot of our work needs to reground in building that trust because communities who have been on the front lines have never been afforded the privilege to not adapt all the time. And so, taking ourselves out of that space of, understanding that our roles as, climate adaptation practitioners is inherently a role of privilege. And so recognizing who the experts are and not just inviting them into the room, but also thinking about the different ways that, our procedures, our interactions are not just keeping people out of the room, but really barring them from entering the space safely. And so, that's why we really started to look at this from a pre-planning perspective. A lot of our cities, particularly in the region that we're coming from, and across, California, and I'm sure others in the room who are not from there feel this way too, but a lot of that historic work to build trust with communities hasn't happened. And so, before we can even start to plan, we need to pre-plan. And a lot of that pre-planning work is looking at these historic injustices and just identifying how and who is going to be impacted, who do we need to engage, what are those opportunities that we have to enhance resilience from the get-go by reassessing this framework kind of from that equity and privilege mindset. It also helps our practitioners understand those systemic issues. Not everyone has a background in this work, and so also making sure that our practitioners are equipped with the information to do that. So, and also understand how this is, contributing to persistent inequities. One example I love to give is, I've heard of some folks designing these resilience hubs at police stations. In theory, great idea. They have backup power already. They have resources, but not everyone is safe at a police station. Not everyone whose skin color is different than mine is safe at a police station. In San Diego, as Nichole mentioned, we do have the busiest cross-international transit hub in the world globally. Not everyone is safe at a police station. So it's thinking about these things from a different perspective of just because on paper that sounds practical monetarily, in practice, you have not done the labor to make that a safe space. And so it's not just not a resilience hub, it's also the opposite, right? It's really pulling us into a different direction of giving power back to that status quo. So that's kind of our framework and methodology here. We're gonna do an activity, so please bear with me while I try to explain it. I know there's a lot of words on this slide, but I promise I'll have you all go into groups, and I do have worksheets so you can read it. So if you can't read this, please don't worry. So we're gonna kind of, put ourselves into a scenario-based practice. I'm gonna ask everyone to take off your work hats of whatever organization you came here for and put on your pretending imagination hats. So our activity, recent heat waves have plagued cities and counties across North America. These heat waves have been prolonged, lasting 10 to 14 days in some places, and a lot of them were breaking records for some of the hottest nighttime heat temperatures, so it's not cooling down at nighttime. As a result, many of our communities and households have been asked to conserve energy. If you're from California, you might have got that energy flex alert. First time we've done that ever. As a result, you've probably experienced higher costs for your energy. So if you are using to run your AC or sometimes medical devices, it's going to cost you a pretty penny. And then in some places, they've even experienced power outages for unknown periods of time. So it's not just that the power is going out, we don't know when it's coming back on. So this impacts our, people who have medical assistive devices, cooling, particularly older adults in the evening times when that temperature. So taking action. So each and every one of you, thank you for being here today. You are an ambitious local city staffer, deeply committed and cares about equity and the community in which you are working. So you individually are embarking on the development of a new adaptation plan. Your city doesn't have one at all. Good luck, fun fact. So you want this adaptation plan, though, to be responsive and mitigate the impact of future incidents. So you want your goals for this endeavor, you really want to identify new science-informed strategies that both adapt and mitigate the impact of future heat waves. So you're really focusing on the heat waves to get started. You really want to deepen and strengthen your community input and lean towards a co-production of adaptation strategies model. And as always, you want to ensure that equity is centered and embedded throughout the life of the plan. So not just at this beginning, but how you're moving forward. So to begin, we're going to have you all kind of group off like 5 to 6 folks, so you can just kind of circle up. We'll kind of go around and ask each group to take on one of the dimensions of equity. If you're feeling ambitious, feel free to do more than that. But we have some prompting questions on here to help you kind of address and get started and start assessing what do you need to get this plan off the ground. Does that sound like a good plan? So we'll do this, we'll separate, Nichole and I will walk around and kind of chat with you all, and then we'll come back together and see what folks are working on. Sound good? Great. Okay. So I hate to interrupt everyone's wonderful conversations, but I'd love to kind of go group by group, and maybe I'll pass the mic around, and if folks can share some of the opportunities or conversations that they were having. And then just really excited. So I'm going to pass the mic around to each group. So if someone can share, and also share which dimension of equity that you all were really focused on. So I'll pass it.
So we had structural equity, which, let me look at the sheet here, involves historical injustices, bias, community cohesion, safety, racism, racial inequities. So some of the group examples that we came up with, we actually have 4. So the first one is leveraging existing community connections and trusted resources to make sure everyone has a seat at the table. The second is meeting the community where they are and acknowledging past injustices. Third, compensating for time and creating accessibility and access so that everyone can have an opportunity to participate. And then the fourth one is prioritizing the people and communities that need the help the most based off of health, income, et cetera, the other categories we had talked about.
Okay, I'll go. We had procedural equity focusing on like the history of inclusion and decision-making processes. And some of our group examples that we were looking into were connecting with community leaders and organizations to actually map out AC units and bill costs along with like cooling centers to see actual access to these, the type of AC unit, what they have, whether it's like installed in the entire home or if they're using an AC window unit, and the differences that makes. We were also looking into thinking about educational resources to gather around, as well as some sort of like town hall-esque event where we include community leaders such as churches who can disseminate information and other organizations. Do you want to add anything? Oh, sorry.
Specifically with town halls, we also talked about how to make them more accessible and I think you pointed out that, you know, we're always like, oh, let's have a town hall, but like no one really comes, and people aren't always, there isn't always that trust with people thinking that they will be heard if they do show up. So things like offering childcare so more people can come participate, and having basic accessibility measures like turning on closed captioning if you're live streaming it or have a Zoom meeting can make a big difference and at least start to grow that trust so that they can become productive settings and events even if they aren't originally.
So, wow, that's really loud. We did procedural equity, which focuses on perceptions of fairness, procedures, decision making, also inclusion and adaptation, influenced by culture and needs, community-led adaptation. So some of our discussion revolved around, you know, when to bring people in, and what point of contacts in the community could really develop that relationship of trust. And some other things that we talked about were, you know, the ability to bridge that education gap for some of the procedures that are put out in the regulatory space to, you know, prohibit land use changes in the community and development. And so there's an opportunity for the community to, you know, public comment and review and kind of like fight that decision through that regulatory space. But often it's not reaching the people in like low-income communities because maybe they don't understand the process as well, because frankly, as a professional, I still don't understand the process. It's very confusing and it's always changing. And so allowing them to be a part of the story in that space and simplifying the procedures and empowering them to do so, because they're not the same as like the not in my backyard folks who, you know, are really familiar with that process and are very loud. And did I miss anything else, guys? That's. We love our CEQA in California.
So we did structural equity as well. And really for us, as starting with the notion that many folks have been excluded from the decision-making process, and so we first have to ask the question of how we bring these folks into the process, particularly given that folks are concerned about things that have nothing to do with climate and how we bring those factors into the process as well. And particularly with the case of the built of the built and built environment, like we have to tie we have to tie things to historical redlining. As well as for example, whether someone's immigration status, what someone's immigration status is, and how that may impact, for example, the landlord-to-tenant relationship. So just generally meeting the community where they're at, and so really an approach. Edge to doing this can be to partner with the EBO to sort of be like, okay, who are we missing after coming up with a preliminary list, rather than just coming up with the list as of folks to include ourselves, and so yeah, that's mainly what we discuss.
That's great. And I want to touch on that really quickly. I think you said something really important. Is this on? Okay. Is that people don't know how it's affecting their day-to-day lives, right? So those day-to-day concerns are going to be the most important things to them, but how, you know, it might affect their heating and cooling bill, or how some of these
policy changes are going to affect them, right? So really building in how climate's impacting them on a day-to-day basis, so they're more willing to engage. They know it's tied to climate change. So I really appreciate you pointing that out. Thanks.
Another thing that we discussed. Another thing that we discuss is that building relationships is a long-term process, and we cannot just like show up to the community groups or community organization and expect them to like open up to us and have like a in-depth conversation. So that kind of like acknowledging that this is a time-consuming process and being invested on that. And another point that was brought up in our discussion is also making sure that we have the resources to deliver and that we are not just like engaging with the community, talking a lot about this, and then we're not able to deliver and or to like give back what we are promising, kind of thing. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point. I wanted to also echo, because I think someone over here mentioned compensation for community groups. But I do think it's important for us to recognize it goes beyond compensation and it goes beyond that long-term relationship, that it's really like kind of, you know, audacious of us to assume that the community wants to drop all of the work that this, you know, CBO is doing to show up to help us as, you know, city planners in this kind of practical context. So it's also important not just to compensate folks for the time we're asking them to be in the spaces that we're looking for their expertise, but also compensate them for all the work they're not doing because they're showing up. And cities need to understand that this comes into the, you know, power dynamics that we have in the procedural equity, where sometimes for those CBOs, when we're finally opening up the dialogues for them to come to the table, the cost of them not showing up is often way more than what we're offering them. And so we need to be really mindful of what that cost that they're neglecting in their communities to show up and be the voice, because we haven't offered them that space in the first place. So I think that point is really important. It takes a long time and it is way more expensive than anyone ever thinks it is. Anyone else from this group? Someone over here?
Okay, so we had interactional equity, and so one of our group examples to kind of break down the power dynamics with interactions is and the interpersonal interactions is to partner with the local community-based organizations, but obviously not just to use them as a conduit for, you know, transferring knowledge and to these communities, but mainly because they know the struggles within the communities, and sometimes they're leaders within that community who can better articulate to the community better than just, I think you shared an experience, instead of just translating verbatim kind of what the city is doing. There needs to be a better partnership and working and thinking through the type of language that's being used when you're communicating. And I think the best way to do that is to partner with these community organizations. And so that was one of our group examples. And then we mentioned really meeting people where they are. And so not just holding community and, like you said, town halls that are not very interpersonal and may not be safe places that those communities feel like they can be at, but maybe meeting them where they are, attending community events, and being just a presence. Not just being there, just be an informational booth, but really integrating yourself into that community event. Because you shared an experience, and I hope you would share that now about how they approached you, community members just approached you and kind of unloaded on you.
Yeah, so we are with the city and we work in the equity space in terms of extreme heat. And we have done some community engagement with our more low-income neighborhoods. And we held an engagement event that was only about extreme heat. But in the end, we were approached by various community members asking us questions about other services that they needed, maybe something to do with sewage, something to do with their landlord and their mobile home park. So it was a realization that these community members didn't really have anyone to rely on and didn't have access to city staff.
And we've also experienced that some city-held events have a police presence, and the only community members who show up to those events are white people who are already engaged in their community and not people of color. So also changing who in the city we involve at these events.
Yeah, definitely translating and moving and, you know, reallocating police funding power in these places is a climate adaptation strategy, right?
And just real quick, I also like just thinking about how to break down interactional inequities in terms of like breaking the barrier between, or the boundaries between, those who work in the city and then those who are part of the communities, by providing like fellowships and interns to people in the community, providing professional development and job opportunities, so that that's not as much of an issue going forward with projects, and there's community buy-in, because the projects are, you know, actually formulated by people within the communities in the first place.
I think that's really important. So I think did we miss a group back there? Okay. And then also, just communities are providing valuable resources. So I think Portland and Seattle and some work in Boston recognizes that they're really serving as consultants when you come in and you're asking them for information, right? So approaching it in that way, in a mutually beneficial relationship, or there are different ways to do that. And they're embedded in our Equity First guidance document. So.
We only have a few minutes left, so I think there's one group back there and then you all on our side.
Okay, we can go quick. So our group was inspired by the procedural equity concept, and talked about a lot, as I think we all did, but some of our highlights, for examples, were talking about how us as the city planner, right, might not be the right person to be presenting a lot of this information, to be that community connection, and so we wanted to really focus on identifying and supporting community leaders and undergoing that very in-depth trust-building process. And then we wanted to also talk about how these communities who are experiencing this, they know what they need, similar to y'all were talking about during the presentation, and so really making sure that we're understanding these impacts from our community's words, and listening to their needs when we're operating under that solution development process. And then we really wanted to also focus to make sure that we were considering all of our impacted community members. And so we were thinking about all of the different types of people who were in these communities, right? We talked about commuters as well, right, with their bus operations and making sure that those stops are really accessible and also cool. The health concerns for those who have them and how those can be exacerbated, outdoor workers, all sorts of different community members within already difficult communities some of the time. And so really kind of operating under, we were talking about like all of the different W questions, right? The who, the what, the where, the when, all of it. Did y'all have any?
Great. I think we have our last group up here.
All right, because we don't have a lot of time. My session's the next one with these folks back there at 11:30. So we were distributive. We spent some time just thinking about, what types of resources are we talking about? And we looked at both resources to the individual, cooling in their homes, being able to, if they're housed, that was an important point that you made, versus longer term interventions, where are green spaces distributed throughout the community, the tree canopy. I mean, those are going to be longer term efforts, longer term solutions that take time to implement. And, we didn't get to the discussion around some examples, though, for expanding cooling centers for people who are unhoused, for example. But someone did make the point in another session that the periods of heat are going to last longer. So we're not going to be able to just have people show up at cooling centers forever. So I don't know that we resolved that distributive question. But it is, multidimensional in terms of, are you housed, are you unhoused, are you renter, are you a homeowner? what can you do in the immediate, and then what can I'm a planner, do in the longer term to kind of support the overall community resilience. I think that was our discussion. Did you want to add something? She's pointing to you like she thinks she should say something.
I guess just in regards to the policies and at the state level, you know, so we talked about like some states who have community solar programs and incentives in that way, and even in that, it seems that HOAs are taking advantage of that, and that in itself is another way of marginalizing these groups. So kind of like implementing policies that are benefiting these groups, and so I don't know.
I know we're kind of out of time, so really appreciate you all kind of tackling our world's problems in 12 minutes. But I do want to mention just a few things. So the equity guidance document is a very large framework. We do take space to go through the California, 4 phases of adaptation planning, but there's a lot of really great transferable work in there. We also developed curriculum. So we did a very small piece of that curriculum here today, but we have curriculum for this a little bit more in depth, capacity building and stakeholder engagement, which is not publicly on our website because it's much more like practitioner focused. But if you want that, please feel free to email me. We'd love to share it around and make sure that folks have access to it. Or if you want help figuring out how to do those trainings, please just let us know. But yeah, really hope folks can use the resources. I don't know if that QR code works. I'll be fully honest with you. The one I did on the other presentation did not work. So I don't think I was tech savvy enough to figure that out. I tried to be cool. But those are our emails. If you need anything, please feel free to reach out to us. Happy to share. Do not want these resources or trainings to be used in silo. But thank you all. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much.